Hi guys, hope everyone's having a fantastic day. In this video we're going to be discussing snake feeding. Going to be going through some tips and tricks and do's and don'ts around snake feeding. Joining me today is Athena. She is my Western Sanzinia, my Western Madagascan tree boa. She's an absolutely stunning snake, wonderful specimen. High yellow as well, she's absolutely stunning. So let's get straight into the video. So first thing when it comes to snake feeding is obviously picking your food. Making sure your food actually comes from a reputable place, whether that being a shop, breeder or online. You need to be making sure the food has been salmonella tested, making sure it looks okay. You might go to some places and they bring out some mice and rats and they look awful basically. Make sure there's no bites, there's no kinks or anything, making sure they've got tails, feet, no chunks or scratches missing out of the prey items basically. Making sure your prey items are healthy are important. Main factor is you can make your snake ill if you're feeding prey items. So once you picked your prey items, next thing is choosing the sizing basically. So the best way to determine a size for your snake will be the thickest part of the snake needs to be about the prey item that they can take basically. So Athena here is on mice fuzzies or rat pups, which are about the same sort of size, which is about the thickness of her. She can now double feed on them every few weeks. I'll double feed her, but you're making sure that the snake is feeding on something in the thickest part. So you can see the middle is about the thickest part. Don't worry about the neck. I have a lot of people come and talk to me about can they actually eat that, because they're worried that so you'll see a royal python, you can say that they can eat like a small wiener out or something, where the thickest part of them is like that and the neck's like that. They can easily take it down. They've got we'll get into that, but they can easily take it. So you need to be going for the thickest part of the snake. You want to be, if they're eating something the same thickness as the thickest part, they'll leave a little lump, so you know it's actually a decent meal. So if it's too small, it won't leave a lump, and you know that they could probably start double feeding them if they're on that size. Athena here is double feeding on mice fuzzies. A rat pup kind of gives a nice little lump. Knowing when to double feed is fairly important, because obviously the sizing is done in weight. There won't be a size for every single month or year of your animal basically whilst it's growing. So sometimes, like a couple of my snakes in this video, you'll see actually get fed twice. Like my hognose, who is feeding on 2 mice pinkies a week. She's not big enough to actually be eating mice fuzzies, but she's too big to be eating one pinky, so she gets 2. You have to make sure that they're actually passing. They're going toilet basically, because some snakes like to hold back on going to the toilet, and you don't want that can cause impaction. You don't want impaction. So we kind of touched on it a little bit with my hognose, but knowing how often your snake needs to feed, this will vary depending on the species. So I'll kind of break it down a little bit. So a lot of colubrid species, so like your corn snakes, hognoses, milks, kings, most live what people keep. They'll be feeding, they have fairly fast metabolism, so you need to be feeding about once a week on appropriate size prey items. When it comes to actual feeding, this is like a little tip for me anyway. I like to feed, you'll see sometimes I like to feed something smaller one week or then a larger one and leave them for a little bit longer. It just kind of, it's a little bit of enrichment sometimes, because they can then get double fed or have like a larger meal, which I find is quite nice, because they're not going to be eating the same size in the wild. And they get a lot of nutrients and stuff out of that anyway. Making sure that you know how often your snake needs to feed. Athena here, she's a boa. Boas are renowned for having quite fairly slow metabolism for snakes. So she doesn't get fed, she gets fed 7 to 10 days, every 7 to 10 days. Whereas a lot of my stuff is feeding a lot 7 days. I feed her, you kind of go off if they're going toilet. So kind of, you'll see royal pythons, if they're feeding, as an example, if they're feeding something decent sized, they'll pass that after about 5 or 6 days, and you feed on the 7th. If they're doing that fairly regularly, you know you're actually doing something well. If they're not then passing, I wouldn't recommend feeding, because again that can cause impaction. My big female boa, who is down here, she is getting fed every 1 to 2 months, depending on the prey item. So she's on XXL rats, so like 500 gram plus. She gets fed them every month. if I feed her something larger like a rabbit, she'll get fed that once every 2 months. She actually got fed a rabbit last year, refused when I tried to feed her another one 2 months later. So she went 4 months without food, and then she's been eating rats ever since. She's had a small rabbit since then and a guinea pig, but they're only small, like about the same size as the rats. She hasn't had a big prey item again. But the offering variety as well, you can find different prey items. It's not just rats and mice. You can find guinea pigs, chicks, all sorts of different things. Whereas my Burmese python, who is in this one, is actually down there. He's getting fed every 1 to 2 weeks on basically the same sort of prey item as Honey, my female boa. They have a faster metabolism. A lot of python species do anyway. Burms are renowned for, they like to hold their poo. They don't go toilet every single week. So I need to make sure that he doesn't get impacted. So I'll give him a few weeks, and then if he hasn't gone toilet, I won't feed him until he passes anyway. A tip for making a snake go to the toilet, or any reptile really, is give them a bath. You can massage the back end like just before the cloaca, and it usually helps them pass their poo basically. So with a lot of younger animals, so my green tree python for example, they're getting fed every 5 to 7 days. It will vary from species to species and from age of the animal. Usually baby snakes will need to be fed more often than adult snakes. As for example, the green tree python, when he's an adult, get fed every 7 to 14 days, or 10 to 14 days rather than every 5 to 7. You can see him eating in this video anyway. I'm throwing clips over me talking, so you'll be able to see. So it's kind of variation depending on the snake species, but kind of touched up on it a little bit. Pythons and colubras kind of have a faster metabolism, and as the snake gets older, they won't be feeding as often. And obviously as they get older, the prey items get larger, so it takes a little bit longer for them to digest, because there's not a lot in a pinky compared to a fully grown rat. There's a lot more nutrients for them to digest. There's bones, there's fur. You'll see little fur poos come out as well. So how do you feed your snake? So when it comes to actually feeding, you'll see me throw up some clips of my snakes feeding, so you can kind of get a gauge of how I'm feeding them. But from start to finish, you want to be defrosting your frozen thawed stuff anyway. So making sure that you're getting it out throughout the day, making sure it's fully defrosted. Where you can test that is like using your tongs, or if you want to feel the rat, make sure it's fully, you can't feel any ice or anything. Belly feels nice and squidgy. You'll see they'll start to smell as they're like fully defrosted. And then knowing what actually you're feeding. So all my boas and pythons, warm up the food for them a little bit. So literally you can do that 2 ways. You can either put the actual rat or mice in warm water, and then dry it off as you then go to feed, or you can put it in a bag of warm water. So you put it, some people do it, I don't do it. Put the rat or mouse in a bag, like a freezer bag, tie it together and put that in warm water, warm it up, and it does it slowly. If you want, you can just do it how I do it, put it in the warm water, making sure you're drying it off with some paper towel, and then feeding it to your snake. So you'll see like boas and pythons, he doesn't actually get his face out. They have heat pits on the front of their face. They actually go off the heat. They can feel the heat signatures of the animal. So they go off that when it comes to feeding. So a lot of the times, if you're feeding like a royal, and it's not eating, and you're not warming up the prey item, I guarantee for the most part, if you then warm the prey item up, it'll probably eat, which is a nice little tip for you. If you're having a really tricky feeder, like my green tree python was when I first got him, complete darkness. He's now in a tiny rub with, as you can see, he's in a rub with paper all the way around, so he's like feels nice and secure. But making sure you're using boiling water rather than just warm water, it really helps them, stimulate them basically. It makes them then thrash out towards the prey item. I used to have to get a mug of boiling water, dip it in there, because obviously it's only a little pinky. They cool off pretty fast because they're only tiny. So you just dip it in there, get him to strike, and then once he's struck, he'll then coil it and eat it basically. But boiling water is a nice little tip. Just if you're having a tricky feeder, boiling water usually helps. But obviously make sure you're not trying to burn your snake. So boiling water, dry it off, feed it, so it's not that you've got boiling water there. So we've talked about warming your prey items. Obviously that would be, I recommend doing that for most snakes anyway, more naturalistic for them depending on what species they are. But also knowing what species you're actually feeding. Like my king rat snake is a very visual snake, so they go off movement. So in this video, I don't really have to do a lot for him to feed down. He just like demolishes food. But like for the hognose and things, you need to wiggle the food a little bit, make it look like it's alive. If they're visual snakes, they need to go off movement, so they won't go off warmth. They'll literally just see like a little bit of movement and they'll smash it. So making sure you're wiggling it. Make it, when you are wiggling, don't overdo it. A lot of people, they'll like thrash it around like that. It'll scare the snake and it will make it not want to eat, which is when you have to kind of like drop feed. Making sure you're just like slightly wiggling, holding the rat or the mouse at the back end of it, so like where the pelvis is, or on the tail. You might see with some of my snakes, like I have done with Walnut, my Burm. Hold the tail or the back of the snake and wiggle it, back of the rat, wiggle it slightly. That's the best way to get them to feed. Snake feeding equipment. What we need, you'll probably need some feeding tongs, as I don't recommend holding your mouse. I see a lot of people do it, and if it works well for a few years, great. And then that one time you get a feeding response bite from a large snake, which I think there's a viral video of a lady getting done, a bit by, I think it's a boa or a retic. Yeah, you don't want to feed a response bite. So make sure you've got some feeding tongs. Make sure they're the correct length. My feeding tongs are about a foot. It works well for pretty much all of them, but as I've now got some larger snakes, and I will have some larger snakes in the future as well, like some of my baby snakes, they're going to get quite large. Make sure you have appropriate size feeding tongs. If you've got a large snake and you're feeding a large prey item, you need some large tongs so you're not right next to the snake. Feeding tongs, whether that being actual tongs or forceps, there's some forceps ones which are a little bit more heavy duty, so if you're feeding like a rabbit which is quite strong or quite heavy, feeding tongs sometimes are a little bit flimsy. More things you'll need something to defrost your mice and rats and chicks or whatever you're feeding. Whether that being a bowl, plate, a bag, or something, anything that will really defrost them. Don't ever put your mice or rats in the microwave. You'll pop them and it will be horrific for your mum to try and clean up. So snake hook, when it comes to feeding, obviously you don't need one. I recommend any snake keeper to have a snake hook if you have snakes, have a snake hook. It's very good. But if it's there on duty, so with my anaconda, I'll go into that a little bit more. We drop food item, he then misses that, he doesn't see that drop, and then I've got to try and pick it up. If I've got the snake hook, I can then not bat him away, but I can push him away slightly, and then I can go and retrieve the food item. Obviously, the snake hooks are really there for like a protection thing when it comes to snake feeding, or trying to find your snake if it's like buried itself and you can't get it. Feeling around for your snake with your hands, if they're in feeding mode, you're going to get a bite. So making sure you've got a snake hook to go through the substrate or something is quite handy. So in this clip, I am showing you my male yellow anaconda feeding. I actually cut the footage because I wanted a video of everyone feeding, almost all the snakes that I was feeding that day. So I actually cut the footage half because I dropped the rat. So I'm going to tell you some tips basically, and do's and don'ts for when it comes to that. I don't have the correct feeding tongs. I have my feeding tongs, like I said, are a foot long. He is about 6.5 foot snake, 7 foot push, I think. And the rat was literally under his chin, as you can see in the footage. If I was to then go and pick that rat up in front of his face, with the feeding tongs I have, I would have got bit because he was going off movement. You could see him in the video, he was like any sort of movement, he was like swaying towards slightly. I can't remember if I've actually got footage of that. So making sure you have the correct feeding, and you're not just going to then go pick it up with your hands or something. Don't panic is the main thing that I will say. I could have panicked then, I could have gone, oh my god, I'm going to go pick it up and just like get bitten instantly. Just kind of letting him do his thing. The way I actually did then get him to feed, I didn't do anything other than literally push him away with the snake hook. I then literally, with the snake hook, touched the rat and he just struck it and took it straight away. So don't panic in those situations. Just please don't get bit. That's kind of like some don'ts there. You don't really want to get bit by that. Just be aware of those sort of situations. With smaller snakes, it's absolutely fine. You know, you've got feeding tongs, or if I had the appropriate equipment to actually go and take the food away, like if I had some 3-foot tongs, it would have been absolutely fine. But yeah, just knowing your snake, knowing the situation, don't get bit. Now we're going to discuss myth busting with snakes and how snakes actually do eat. You may have heard as a snake person, non-snake people say snakes dislocate their jaw. They actually don't. Snakes have a bone called the quadrate bone, which is an extra bone in their like lower jaw attached to them. It's about here, which means they can extend their jaw even wider, which is quite incredible. Which is how they open their mouth so wide. But the biggest trick to it is they have 2 lower jaw bones basically. And they have elasticated ligaments between, so they can open the mouth really wide at the bottom and get the food down. It also works with having ribs that are very, very flexible. So obviously they can get their food item down quite easily, and they can kind of contract their body to squeeze it all the way down, and they contract all their muscles and squeeze it down as their stomach, which is then where the mouse or rat stays. So snakes are pretty interesting when it comes to feeding. They also are quite, I wouldn't say smart, but they know what they're doing. So green tree pythons, you'll see it in most arboreal snakes because they're sitting on a tree, they'll be perched. Mostly in carpet pythons, I know a lot of people keep carpet pythons. They'll be perched on something and they're eating at the same time. My scrub python actually did it, you'll see her, and the olive python. They'll perch, and as they're perching, they'll be eating it up, and they're not really contracting much, they're kind of just letting it slide down. You may have seen it in your royal python, you may have seen it in your corn snake. First time I saw it ever in my corn snake, it was the best thing I've ever seen in my life. Like little 12-year-old me seeing a little corn snake do that with its head, seeing a little pinky go down, it was amazing. So knowing when your snake is going to feed, that's another big thing. If they're in shed, a lot of snakes won't eat in shed. I have most of mine will eat whilst they're in shed. But in this video, I tried to get a video of my Amazon tree boa eating, and he did not want to eat whilst he was in the shed. He's the only snake I've got that hasn't eaten whilst he's in the shed. So a lot of snakes, whilst they're in shed, they feel quite vulnerable. They're not really wanting to do anything. They just want to get the shed cycle over and done with. So they're not going to eat anything. Being vulnerable whilst they're in shed, and then snakes are the most vulnerable when they're actually digesting food. They can't move very fast. They can't actually do a lot whilst they're digesting the food, which is why we don't recommend handling once they've eaten for about 24 hours. It'll depend on the snake. So Athena, most of the smaller snakes, they'll be absolutely anything like under 5 foot. After 24 hours, probably handle. Be really slow to kind of let them do what they want. I just kind of say leave them for a couple of days, but 24 hours is about right. Anything larger, so Honey, my boa, when she fed on her rabbit, I left her for about a week before I even tried to handle her at all. You kind of just want to leave them to it whilst they're digesting their food. Like I say, they're at the most vulnerable when they've actually eaten, so they're at risk of regurgitation. You'll see it in a lot of videos. There's a viral video, green anaconda, I believe it was a green anaconda or a berm. They regurged this giant, like, I don't even know what it was, this giant food item. Regurgitation in snakes is actually quite bad, depending on how long. If it's like got down part way and they know they can't take it, it's not too bad. But it can like rip the insides, and it can tear them, it can do a lot of damage. Some bad cases, regurgitation can actually kill their snakes. Like that's really bad ones. So you want to watch that whenever you're handling your snakes as well after feeding. So with snakes eating, it's pretty interesting. They have an extension to their trachea, which they can actually throw outside. They can push outside the side of their mouth whilst they're eating, which actually helps with just breathing basically, because they can't breathe through their nose if they're eating something that like completely disfigures their face. So they need kind of throw it out to the side of their mouth, and it will help them breathe all in front of them, which helps with breathing when they're eating. So if you've got a larger snake, that you'll probably see that on. Have a look and see if you see it, because it's quite interesting. But yeah, I hope everyone did learn something. Hope everyone enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Please smash that like button and the subscribe button. It'd be a massive help for me. Yeah, have a great day.